we have to be ruthless and very pragmatic to make sure that the credibility of the field is not damaged.
Every ton of CO2 reused is a ton of fossil carbon that doesn't need to be extracted.
With sustainable aviation fuel, we're looking at 3 to 10 times the cost of conventional aviation fuel.
Consumers to use a product that's 10 times the price. That really doesn't seem like it's going to be viable. Hello and welcome to The Energy Gang, a discussion show from Wood Mackenzie about the fast-changing world of energy. I'm Ed Crooks, and on today's show we're going to be talking about carbon capture and utilization, or CCU. I think it's a really important part of the toolkit for tackling greenhouse gas emissions, for reasons we're going to be discussing during this show. And to talk about it, I'm joined by my colleague, John Ferrier, who's a senior research analyst at Wood Mackenzie. John's work focuses on the valuation of carbon capture, utilization and storage projects, and on analysing key policies and regulations. Hi, John. Welcome to the Energy Gang.
Thanks, Ed. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, great to have you here. We're also joined by Sarah Lemaison, who's the CEO and co-founder of Dioxycle, which is a clean tech startup working in this area of carbon capture and utilisation. It's developing a new electrolyzer technology called carbon electrolysis, which can be used to convert waste carbon emissions into sustainable chemicals and fuels. Sarah, great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. We'll probably get into what Dioxycle does in a bit more detail a bit later on, but just as a kind of headline for the listeners, how do you describe what it is that the company does? What's your elevator pitch?
At Dioxycle, we have developed a novel technology that turns carbon emissions, so CO, CO2, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, into clean essential chemicals like ethylene, which is the world's most used organic chemical, using just electricity and water. So, I mean, happy to go into more details, but hopefully that's enough for the elevator.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great illustration of what we're talking about here on the show. When we talk about carbon capture and utilization, I think often people are more familiar perhaps with carbon capture and storage. People are familiar with the idea of capturing carbon emissions from industrial processes, power generation, whatever, and compressing it, storing the carbon dioxide under the ground. What we're talking about here is actually taking that carbon dioxide and doing something productive and valuable with it, as you say, like turning it into chemicals and other products. And finally, we're also very pleased to welcome to the Energy Gang Tim van den Berg, who's a climate tech innovation lead at the World Economic Forum, where he brings together innovators and policymakers to work to accelerate clean energy technologies. And you're also just publishing your new white paper on the subject, carbon capture and utilization, right? This is going out Monday, September the 22nd. It's the first day of Climate Week. And you're launching this new report then, right?
Exactly, Ed, and thank you for having me on this podcast. It's wonderful to be here, and you're exactly right to note that we're starting off Climate Week from our side with a collaboration with Wood Mackenzie on indeed a white paper that looks into scaling carbon capture and utilization pathways.
Right, well, great to have you on the show. Welcome to the Energy Gang. Thanks very much for joining us as well. I introduced this show by saying that I thought carbon capture and utilization was an important part of the toolkit for tackling climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I thought it would make sense to start off by thinking a little bit about why that is and where carbon capture and utilization can fit into the broader landscape of technologies for decarbonizing the energy system. Maybe, Sarah, perhaps could I start with you on this one? We've talked a little bit about it, but in terms of what the role of CCU is, as I say, it's part of that toolkit, where do you see it fitting in alongside other technologies, renewables, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, whatever else it might be? What is the particular contribution of CCU and why is it important?
First of all, I want to start by saying that CCU is not the answer to everything. I think it's very important that we think holistically about decarbonization and that we do implement the technology that are the most efficient on a ton of CO2 abated per megawatt hour used in the right order. And so by priority, starting with the one that have the highest decarbonization potential. So when we think about decarbonizing a furnace in an industry, it's very likely not CCU that is the answer, and we should just electrify the furnace instead of first turning CO2 into methane and then reusing that methane for a furnace. However, there is one particular industry that cannot be decarbonized, which is the chemical industry, because it is the industry of carbon. So for this industry, I think CCU can play a very, very important role. And so the advantage of CCU, especially for the chemical industry, is double. First, one key aspect is that CCU provides a dual decarbonization opportunity. Because when you think about chemical processes, so for example, to produce ethylene, the world's most used organic chemical used in plastics, surfactants, and a number of construction material, the way it's produced right now emits 1 to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of ethylene produced. So by doing CCU, now you're first avoiding these 1 to 2 tons of CO2 emitted per ton of ethylene produced. But you're also using other source of emission and repurposing them to make the ethylene. And so now you're not only avoiding the 1 to 2 tons, but you're also using 3.14 tons of CO2 per ton of ethylene you're making. And so your total potential decarbonization opportunity is like 4 to 5. So that's the first point. And the second point I think that is very valuable about CCU is the fact that it can retrofit existing assets, meaning that now, when we think about the speed and scale at which we need to scale these technologies to reach net zero, CCU offers a way to leverage existing assets, billion-dollar assets that are already there, and really help teaching existing incumbents how to use these novel process while also leveraging these assets which are already amortized. And so I think it's a low capex approach to these hard to abate sectors and to provide them with a way to reduce their emissions.
Right, that is really interesting, actually, and that does begin to answer a question that I've often had about CCU, which is, so probably a lot of people will be more familiar with carbon capture and storage. Why go to utilization instead? What are the benefits of that route? I think you've made that very clear. I think clearly there are some issues, there's barriers, obstacles, and challenges as well. We'll get into those in a moment. But yeah, okay, I do see the point about CCU as opposed to CCS. Tim, maybe bring you in on this. What's your take on this? And as I say, you're publishing this report for Climate Week on CCU. Why do you see it as an important group of technologies?
Yeah, I think Sarah, did a deep dive on this already for the chemical industry, right? But if allow me to zoom out a little bit, like how we look at CCU is more as a complementary tool to decarbonize and specifically to potentially defossilize industries that are still for now very dependent on carbon feedstocks, right? But it is about the source of that carbon feedstock. Is it a fossil base or is it a sustainable source of carbon, right? So think, for example, aviation fuel, chemicals, building materials. Those are sectors where we can't electrify everything. And what CCU does in those instances is that it allows to substitute captured carbon for virgin fossil carbon. Hopefully, at scale, creating a circular carbon economy, right? That's the ultimate systems-wide end goal of these technologies, hopefully. What we see right now is that the potential of CCU to do that system unlocking is hindered by things such as, for example, policy frameworks. They often undervalue that contribution because, the climate benefits from CCU are harder to quantify than permanent storage, as you noted on CCS, right? But if we are serious about net zero, we need both tools. So it's not one or the other. We are saying we need a holistic approach across CCUS, right? CCS for removals and CCU for a circular carbon economy. And so for us, the opportunity now is to create clear technology agnostic incentives and assets such as standardized life cycle assessments so that utilization pathways can be properly recognized, or at least starting to be properly recognized.
Right, got it. Thanks very much. And I want to get into some of those issues like the policy barriers you mentioned in a moment. Before we do though, John, I want to bring you in here. You cover the whole of the industry, the whole of the CCUS industry. Where do you see utilization fitting in alongside storage? And how would you characterize the state of the industry today?
Yeah, well, I think key point is it's still at a very early stage. And if we look at CCS project pipeline, there's a lot more advanced projects. We're seeing, the scale of emissions being handled is much greater than we're seeing with CCU. And I think perhaps another interesting point to kind of pick out, we've talked a bit about chemicals, we talked about fuels, and, the real point here is with CCU, we're talking about a wide range of different applications with different emissions benefits, as Tim has mentioned. There are also types of CCU which in essence function similarly to conventional CCS, right? So we have things like CO2 treated building materials, treating alkali minerals with CO2 to generate carbonates, which store carbon over centuries, it is sort of functionally, from an emissions benefit perspective, equivalent to CCS. So we're seeing some of that, and the same kind of incentives that are useful for CCS, carbon pricing, for example, can more directly apply to those. So some are more advanced. Some of the policy frameworks are better suited to some applications that currently exist. There's a lot of policy development that's needed. Carbon capture and storage is definitely seeing more momentum behind it. I think what's interesting from a carbon capture perspective, carbon capture and storage is in essence inherently non-productive. It's an additional cost for the most part, and the projects that are progressing for CCS derive revenue from the regulatory support that they receive, or EOR, or something like that. But with carbon capture and utilization, there's
EOR footnote, EOR enhanced oil recovery. So that's taking carbon dioxide, injecting it into the oil field to get the oil out more easily.
Yes, and there's a degree of contention around that. Some people consider that to be utilization, others don't. I think we generally consider it would that it isn't utilization. And if you look at the IPCC definition, that classifies CCU as carbon within a product. But, in the absence of regulatory support, if you have an opportunity to use the CO2 stream that you're capturing and direct it towards, as a feedstock to produce a product, you can start to supplement your revenue with that you get from subsidy with something else. And so we are seeing the first signs that CCU can be used to help kind of offset some of those CCS costs as well. So there's a degree of kind of interplay as well.
Right. And so let's talk about policy for a bit. Is it the case then that at the moment there is more policy support for CCS, for storage, than there is for utilization? Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very clearly true. There are subsidy mechanisms around, popping up all over the world or in CCS, business models in the UK, all sorts in Europe. There's, in the US as well, although they also have a tax credit for utilization as well. So proportionately, there's definitely more support behind CCS. We are starting to see more around CCU, but I think given the kind of the spectrum of end products we're talking about, that presents a bit of a policy challenge. And I think from a policy thinking perspective, policy strategy perspective, there are much clearer visions around the role that CCS is expected to play, and I think that's feeding in as well to how much subsidy support there is.
Right. Are there particular reasons for that then? Is that, why is it that you think storage has generally been favoured until now?
I think, to be honest, it comes down to prioritizing emissions reductions very quickly. And I think, as sort of Tim's mentioned, with CCS, emissions reductions are more measurable, more tangible in some way. In many cases, you conceptually you have an emission source here, you need to intersect that, and in many cases using off-the-shelf technologies with CCS essentially. And so I think there's a simplicity to that. I think when you have carbon pricing that directly values those emissions reductions, that's the source of revenue, and you can start to hang out additional subsidy off of that. So I think it's, largely just this sense of we need tangible emissions reductions now. Countries have their nationally determined contributions, they have their emissions reduction targets, whereas CCU is far more complex. You're talking about avoided emissions in some cases, you're talking about conventional reductions in other cases, you're talking about removals in some cases, and you're also talking about a range of different products which might require very specific incentives to try and incentivize. It might be demand side measures, or they might be other forms. So it's just the complexity around CCU and the diversity as well.
Right. Sarah, so how do you see this then? So at Dioxycle, you are trying to navigate this complex policy landscape. You're doing it for real. What impact does policy have on you? Is it very important to your business? How much is policy helping you right now?
The European policy landscape is quite harsh, to be honest, on CCU. Because I think the intention has been good initially, and how incentives has been set up around the EU ETS framework, etc. However, what happens right now in Europe is that if you take a chemical plant that is taking fossil feedstock and turning that into a chemical, this chemical plant within the EU ETS framework is going to pay for the emissions they are emitting. However, they're not going to pay for the carbon content that is embedded in the chemical and that is, living at the gate of their factory. However, if you look at a CCU play now, if you take the same plant but now consider the source of carbon is not fossil, but it's an emission, actually the plant still needs to pay for the emission as if they had emitted it. So now the plant is paying for that, which means that the CCU industry is not even advantaged. It's not even neutral. It's put at a disadvantage versus fossil, which I don't think was ever the intention of, the European Commission. And it's really a loophole that like a number of companies and groups have been trying to fix for a number of years. And now we are really hoping for the EU ETS revision that is coming to fix that problem. And that's going to be very important. So to answer specifically on our case, we actually never bet on any policy support. I like to say that we are healthily cynical, although that's quite sad. But anyway, it would of course change a lot of things, and that's also why I think there's not so many companies doing CCU right now. When you think about climate tech in general, you have a lot of people doing like geothermal, like a number of things, electrification, but CCU is still like quite a niche pool of companies because of this in particular, because not only you have to create a new technology, and now you also have to face this kind of non-level playing field, which is hard. In the US, interestingly, actually, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, because as you were saying, I don't remember if it was you, Tim, or John, the 45Q tax credit recognize carbon utilization and provide like a tax credit for carbon utilization, and the one big beautiful bill increase that tax credit from $60 to $85 per ton of carbon utilized, which can be CO2 or CO, which is interesting because there are some interesting pathways that are not talked about enough in CO valorization. And so actually now we are seeing our economics being really, uplifted in the US, which is also unexpected. But I think it also comes to the point that you were mentioning that EOR is considered in the US as utilization. And I think that was, we are kind of piggybacking this and benefiting from the support to EOR and more the oil and gas industry right now.
Right, because Dioxycle, you have dual headquarters, right? You're based in Paris, where you are now, and also I know you have a headquarters in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I actually happen to be myself right now. You have the option, I guess, of investing in Europe or the US. Is the US now then actually a much more attractive market to invest in because of that 45Q credit you're talking about?
When you think that 1 ton of ethylene to be produced takes, over 3 tons of CO2 or a bit less of CO to be made, a $25 per ton of CO2 means, 3 times that, $75 per ton of ethylene you're producing of differential. In the US, ethylene is sold at somewhere between $600, $700 per ton. It varies. So you're talking about more than 10% just because of that increase in tax credit, which is huge. So the answer is right now, Europe is a hard environment to be in from a CCU perspective. However, you have also some price dynamics that changes a bit this, because in Europe, because ethylene production is based on naphtha cracking and not ethane cracking like in the US, the cost base is actually higher. So your incumbent that you're trying to disrupt is higher, but your electricity price is also higher. So there is a lot of these questions that are very important. And so when we think about where to locate a project, we really think about like a country, a specific grid. Is it ERCOT in Texas? Is it France with like the very nuclear heavy base load and actually quite low pricing? And we really have to think about region by region project to find the best combination of regional pricing, electricity pricing, and availability of carbon emissions.
So Tim, how do you think about this then when you hear Sarah and John talking about the policy landscape and some of the issues Sarah's been talking about in Europe, and as John's saying, generally around the world, policy frameworks that tend to be more supportive of storage than of utilization? Is there a real problem there? And is there a case for policy reform to introduce significantly more support for utilization?
The underlying dynamic here is that, policy frameworks around the world are really fragmented and inconsistent, right? So we should push for more global interoperability between these policy frameworks. Right now, for example, as they both mentioned earlier, there is a reward that is more rewarding for permanent storage, but it often then overlooks, the climate potential of utilization. And that's not done on purpose, right? But I think what we globally need to go towards is we need technology agnostic policy that don't necessarily back a perceived winner too early, which I think is why we now have so many subsidy penalties, if you will, on CCU, because so much policy is favoring CCS. And that's also because simply we don't know yet. A lot of these pathways in both fields are in its early infancy, right? So we don't know yet which one at scale will be the winner, right? And so instead, design policy so that the market can decide which technology proves themselves. Well, then all credible routes will have a chance to get off the ground. And so I think that's the overarching theme here in policy that we need to work towards at a global scale.
You've been mentioning some of the issues around measuring exactly how many emissions are prevented by utilization technologies. And it seems to be the case then that for storage, it's pretty easy to say, this many tons of CO2, which we're putting in the ground. As John was saying earlier, there's a whole range of different utilization technologies. And is the issue then that the kind of ultimate fate of the carbon dioxide or the carbon monoxide, possibly in some cases, the ultimate fate of that carbon in terms of getting to the atmosphere is unclear often? I mean, to take an example, maybe Sarah, get you on this. You use your captured carbon to make ethylene. That ethylene then goes to make plastic, household goods, stays locked up in plastic for a long time, but eventually does it not kind of breaks down and carbon would get released into the atmosphere in some form? Is part of the problem with these policy frameworks not being as supportive as they could be that this is all so uncertain, we don't know ultimately where the carbon's going to go. Somebody, the industry, whoever it is, needs to do a better job actually of kind of following through with the full life cycle of these emissions. And understanding it better, measuring it better, being able to present a more coherent case to regulators and policymakers about what exactly is happening to the carbon.
That's a great point. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of perhaps misunderstanding there, because we have to think about the question of carbon really from the cradle to gate. So how is the chemical produced, and then the gate to grave. So what happened then in the end of life of the products? Because if you really focus on that cradle to gate, it doesn't matter what happened at the end, as long as you treat all the types of chemicals the same way and you say a plastic, whether it's from fossil origin or from renewable carbon origin or, bio origin, at the end, it might ultimately, with that amount of probability, be re-emitted. If we assume that's the fate of it, we can just focus on how is it produced. And how is it produced now? It's very clear. It's very clear to understand the benefit of CCU when you think about the comparative system, which is how, 45Q tax credits, how the GREET model does it. You have to think about the reference scenario and the comparative scenario. So imagine now you have a steel mill that is making steel and emitting carbon, and you have a cracker that is emitting carbon and making ethylene. If we simplify scandalously, if I can say, you emit 1 ton of CO2 per ton of steel, 1 ton of CO2 per ton of ethylene. What you can really understand intuitively is that if you're now taking the emission of the steel mill and converting that into the plastic, you have just emitted less. You've divided by 2, the emissions, because now you're extracting only once fossil carbon, and this fossil carbon is being reused. So it's simple to say, and now you've divided by 2 the emissions, whatever happens at the end of life. And I think this is a message we need to get out so that people understand the benefit and don't have to do the mental exercise of okay, but what happened at the end of life, which is the same fate for any type of, regardless of the origin of carbon.
I mean, Tim, are you hopeful that policymakers are kind of developing an understanding of some of these issues, are thinking about this? I mean, presumably the way if you talk to a lot of people in policy and regulation as well as in the industry, how much of an education job is there to do to get people to understand some of these issues that Sarah's been talking about?
I think if you look across all the different stakeholder groups that have a stake in CCU, policymakers, industry incumbents, innovators, as Sarah, there needs to be more awareness raising across the board, right? how does CCU fit in the broader climate mitigation picture? How do you incentivize it? To Sarah's point, should we do new life cycle assessment at the point of source of carbon rather than the emissions point, right? And so I think that's what is very crucial to these initiatives that we do at the World Economic Forum, which is kind of like creating that pre-competitive collaboration space. In this instance, the CCU innovation ecosystem that was driven by the World Economic Forum and Uplink, their innovation platform, that brings together these innovators, these industry incumbents, the policymakers, but also financiers, right? Because unlocking finances to scale these technologies is also, has its own hurdles and barriers. To kind of understand in a pre-competitive capacity in terms of like, how can we collaborate? Where is actually the opportunity? And only then, if you have that space for conversation, can we actually be serious about scaling. So definitely there is an awareness raising exercise that needs to be done, and that we're doing with work like this, but it's very much a collective effort across the board.
Right. Okay, so we talked quite a lot about policy and what policy can do to help CCU. I wanted to talk a bit about what the industry can do for itself to help it develop and grow. Maybe, John, bring you in on this first of all, but when you look across carbon capture economics and carbon capture and utilization, carbon capture and storage, how do the economics for CCU projects stack up at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. And again, I'll probably be a stuck record here and say it's very variable. I think it comes down to, well, on the capture side, what kind of CO2 source you're capturing from, on the one hand. So there's a big focus across different CCU pathways to use biogenic and atmospheric CO2. For example, biogenic is sort of more in keeping with the usual cost that we would see on a conventional kind of post-combustion capture project.
But sorry, to be clear then, so biogenic, this would be what? From vegetation?
Yeah. Essentially, there's sort of two groups of CO2 source from an emissions benefit perspective, the kind of the focus. Unavoidable process emissions. So this might be something like a cement plant, in which you will produce CO2 in making cement unrelated to fossil fuel use. And then there are emission sources that are considered kind of part of circulation in essence. So you have biogenic emissions. So if you've burned biomass for fuel, because as plants take out CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow, that CO2 is considered to just be returning to the atmosphere and not added, you're not added anything to circulation. And similarly for atmospheric. So those are kind of the two distinctions.
Yeah, and again, to be clear, atmospheric then, so that would be capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so direct air capture and so on.
But again, it comes down to the kind of end product that you're producing, right? So, we see, on the lower end, cost multiples for CO2 treated building materials much closer to cost competitiveness today, so 1 to 2 times. But then kind of on the more extreme end with sustainable aviation fuel, we're looking at 3 to 10 times the cost of conventional aviation fuel. And in that case, the bulk of that cost is driven by green hydrogen. So, up to 80% of that cost is the cost of green hydrogen. And then by extension, the cost of electricity. So, there's a broad range of different kind of cost multiples depending on the product you're talking about.
Right. So that's really interesting. So, I mean, that 10 times, as you say, at the sort of the extreme end for sustainable aviation fuel, that really sounds like a prohibitive cost if you're asking people to voluntarily pay 10 times the price of the conventional product. If you're asking policymakers to support regulations, policies that would force consumers to use a product that's 10 times the price of the conventional product, that really doesn't seem like it's going to be viable. And probably even if you're only 2 or 3 times the price of the conventional product, again, that's going to be a very, very big challenge in terms of adoption, in terms of finding a commercially viable future for those products, I think. So, Sarah, I don't know where you are now at Dioxycle in terms of your costs relative to conventional production, but when you think about this, are you thinking that you ultimately have to get to a point where you can be cost competitive without subsidy against conventional products?
Yeah, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe there was a path to cost parity. It really depends on the products. And that's the reason why at Dioxycle we are right now not making SAF. Because you have to think about it. It's all about what is the incumbent, how simple and cheap can the incumbent be, so that you as the alternative, when you're taking CO2 or CO and using electricity to produce that same product, you have a chance to compete. The problem with fuel is that it's extremely simple to make. I don't want to say you just dig a hole, but like you have very limited amount of refining. And so like it's dirt cheap as a feedstock. It's dirt cheap. And that's a big problem because it's extremely hard to compete because it's also very energy dense. And we are just not paying for the energy. Like when we are taking fossil fuel, we are just not paying for the energy that has been, accumulating for millions of years in that fuel that we are now benefiting from. So it's extremely hard to think we can compete even just like, a 2x, 3x just at that point in terms of like the premium. Chemicals are different. Because chemicals are hard to make. Actually, when you look at a process scheme to make ethylene, it's absolutely massive. It's like multi-step process, high temperature, high pressure. It's very complex. And so where there's complexity, there's opportunity to undercut, to simplify, to reduce the number of steps, reduce the amount of capex that is in there. And so that's why we have been focused especially on things like ethylene and small molecules, C1 to C3 molecules, which is the sweet spot for carbon electrolysis, the type of technology we are developing. Because instead of breaking down fossil fuel through these very complex high-pressure multi-step processes, we can selectively build it up in a direct, very straightforward process and make it selectively and directly using carbon emission and electricity. And now, if we are energy efficient enough in that process, we have a chance to compete. And so that's really like the thesis behind what we are doing at Dioxycle. And so now, if you want to go one level deeper in that, you have to think about the price in dollar per ton of the product you're making versus the number of electrons, the energy consumption it takes to make that product. And there is a full hierarchy. So for example, products that have a lot of oxygen in there, like carboxylic acids, like formic acids you're using animal nutrition, acetic acid, these kind of things, they are heavy molecules. So in terms of dollar per ton, it's high because it's heavy. The oxygen are very, very heavy. And it's only like 2 to 4 electrons processes. So you can actually like produce that with a minimum energy input in a way. So you have interesting potential margins there. Ethylene, you need more electrons, but as I said, very complex process, the incumbent, that at massive scale, that also poses other question of like people want to back integrate because not everyone can build a 1 million ton per annum cracker to make ethylene and invest 3 billion when they need just like 100 kiloton per annum, things like that. There's a lot of other dynamic at play. And again, like opportunities to undercut this cost, to relocate, to reshore manufacturing and things like this. And so that's really thinking about that mapping that we are finding what are these best products to make in terms of like the market size. And so the decarbonization opportunity, the defossilization opportunity, and also like the trade-off between the amount of energy you need versus the value of the product you're creating.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I don't know how much you want to disclose about your business plan, but in terms of where you are now relative to conventional production, how your costs stack up, and where you think you might be in 5 years, in 10 years. How long is that pathway to being cost competitive without subsidy?
Yeah. Right now we are for our first plant, we plan to be in the range of like recycled material pricing. So just to be completely transparent, what we have done that is new is that we are really working through carbon monoxide electrolysis. And by doing this, by making a 2-step process through carbon monoxide electrolysis, we can really reduce the amount of energy needed because of some technical advantages. And we can also use carbon monoxide emissions, which still have some energy in there, which otherwise would be released as CO2. And so by doing this, we reduce the amount of energy we need, plus we also improve the performance, the energy performance of our technology. And so by doing that, we believe we can reach, for example, if we are thinking about polyethylene, recycled polyethylene type of level in terms of pricing in the short terms. And then we have a path to cost parity. Of course, it's all about the cost of energy. So we have to be smart in terms of like, where do we locate these projects? But there is a clear path to cost parity because, as I said, we are we are ethically cynical or pragmatic, as it's said, as we say it, politically correctly.
Indeed. Realistic, perhaps you might say,
realistic.
about whether policy can be relied on. Indeed.
If I can maybe just add one thing on that, I think I just to clarify, I used the SAF example as an example of how there are these other feedstock costs that come into the products. The SAF example is an extreme one, but as Sarah's mentioned, there's a whole range of products with different technologies with their different routes to cost parity, and there are some applications now, particularly in CO2 treated building materials, where we do see cost competitiveness being cost multiples being 1 to 1.5 times the conventional products. So it very much varies. I wouldn't want that to be the message going forward, that it's 10 to 20 times conventional price.
Yeah, and maybe if I may, and then Ed, I saw you had your hand raised, but if I may kind of like weave the two together both, right? It's kind of what are, from a systemic perspective, a little bit of the different elements that drive down the cost. And to John's point, we already see CCU solutions where it is more cost competitive right now. And if we can create in the near term scale in those solutions, that is very important because it also builds confidence. They see the opportunity of like, hey, it could potentially go there, right? And I think that is very important because on the one hand, if you want to scale these technologies, you're dependent on policy. But on the other hand, you're also very much dependent on investor appetite. You're very much dependent on demand signals from industry players because they want to offtake these solutions, right? And so that also comes into play. And so I think what Sarah and John are touching here on is actually there are different technology pathways at different levels of maturity, but there might be a potential spillover effect. And then once we get to the first pilots, right, and then to the first of a kind plants, and then we go into replication, then we also will see the capex and the opex per unit drop, right? So think the same playbook that we had for solar and wind technology as well. And hopefully over time, we of course hope that innovation and cost will go down in the other fields that we are highly dependent on, right? So if we have a declining cost in green hydrogen or renewable power, that will have a positive spillover effect in CCU. And then efforts like public procurement, right? Like for example, in New York, they have a cement mandate to buy green cement. That also gives a very important signal that the public sector is confident in these technologies as well, right? So I think you need to also think about where does confidence building come from when you want to bring down the cost in a space like this. And we are seeing some promising movements in those directions. And I think the question now is how can we catalyze multi-stakeholder action to start doing that more at scale?
Let's talk a bit about investors as one of those key stakeholders then. It feels like over the past, let's say, 3 years or so, investor appetite for investing in decarbonisation in general has faced a lot of challenges. Actually, the numbers stayed fairly strong through into last year, but you've got to think that this year in particular, obviously, change of administration in the United States, growing focus in many parts of the world on energy security and affordability, concerns about rising energy costs and so on. Part of actually general concern about rising cost of living and inflation in general. All of those things seem to be creating an environment where it is harder now to raise capital for low carbon technologies than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Is that true, do you think, Tim? And is that something that CCU is facing right now?
100%. And you can't generalize it across the CCU, right? Because like some solutions are more cost competitive already and will have an easier time in attracting the financing that they need, right? But I think what we need to do there is that we need to zoom out a little bit and understand the fragmentations in the entire financial value chain, if you will, right? If you look at a lot of the early stage CCU projects that we see right now, they're heavily dependent on grant funding from the public sector. But how do you then go from there to when you have your technology readiness level at 4 or 5 to like early stage VC funding, right? And there's like your first valley of death, as you call it. So I think, what is also the focus of the paper is, I don't think innovation is the issue. There's enough innovation, and we've seen a lot of promising pathways coming out of, universities and then business and whatnot, but it's more about how do we unlock finance to actually scale those innovations there. And there we then need to think about what are some of the new financial mechanisms that we can leverage in support of this. And so I think for CCU in particular, what's very important is patient capital, right? Where there's a longer investment timeline, where there's a higher risk appetite to actually invest in these solutions, and where there's also a higher level of comfort with potential failure of your investment, right? And so I think, we highlight in the paper also some promising examples in the field of programs that do this, and Tencent in China through their Carbon X program is doing exactly that. Right, they take on a higher risk and they focus more on patient capital, so that these technologies have a longer time to develop themselves. And I think those kind of new financing models are, uniquely important for the CCU space in particular.
That's very interesting. So, John, what are you seeing in terms of investor appetite for CCU?
I think certainly there is a bit of concern about policy risk that's emerged. Although the 45Q was enhanced, I think the run-up to that enhancement was a bit volatile, and other sources of funding were withdrawn. And certainly when we've been speaking to particularly early VC investors, they now look for CCU startups that they are considering investing in to have multiple sources of potential revenue beyond a single piece of subsidy, a single piece of legislation. And that really is to protect against the failure of that legislation or a shift in political priorities. So, that's a big concern. Continuing the American example, I think we also heard other countries that are perceived as more stable. I mean, the investment tax credit in Canada was picked out as a potentially more stable subsidy to draw on. So those kind of policy concerns have found their way into investment spheres. But you're also seeing, I think, some recognition of that from startups side as well. We spoke to particular CCU startup Carbon to Stone, who are producing carbonated alkali materials, essentially a direct air capture process. But their pitch is they've adapted their pitch to investors to be able to kind of pivot to what their needs are. So, on the one hand, they can position themselves as a direct air capture company generating removals credits, if that appeals. But they can also pivot to being a waste upcycling company, or both, depending on the specific investors they're speaking to. So it's this kind of flexibility and diversity in revenue stream, I think, is really valued.
So, Sarah, how are you finding it then in terms of getting support from investors and bringing in other stakeholders, getting the kind of network that you need to grow? What's it like out there?
Yeah, beyond investors, there's a number of organizations and initiatives that are very, very important for the ecosystem. So, for example, at Dioxycle, we were lucky to be selected as a Uplink CCU Challenge awardee, which is a joint initiative between the World Economic Forum and the Ministry of Energy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which really brought together like a number of academic but also industrial partners like SABIC, Aramco, Stanford, University of Michigan. And I think this is super important to actually raise awareness. I think we were talking about this a bit earlier, raising awareness about like the need for cross collaboration between different sectors. And so what's really, really great about these kind of initiative is to really give us the forum to get our message out there. And so, for example, with the World Economic Forum, that really makes that link with industrial players and policymakers to really bring together what we need to get a project bankable. So the offtake on the industrial side with the demand, but also like the policymakers aware that the technology are ready, and then being able to put that together to really get a first of a kind project funded.
Right, got it. Yeah, that is really interesting. So I know we should just about leave it there because I know you've got to run. Quickly, before we go, the final thoughts from all of you, if I can. Just interested in your thought about the one thing that's important, the one thing people should be thinking about in terms of making CCU, carbon capture and utilization, a success and actually getting it deployed at scale. Maybe, Tim, start with you. What's the crucial thing you think people should think about?
Well, if I have to say one thing to, I hope, also build kind of like a collective sense of credibility of CCU, right, is that albeit in early stages, CCU is already happening, right? We have the making of jet fuel from captured carbon in Europe. We have methanol production in Saudi Arabia. We have low carbon concrete happening in North America, right? And every ton of CO2 reuse is a ton of fossil carbon that doesn't need to be extracted. And I think what should be an incentive, to mobilize more players into this space, and especially for industries that are under pressure from regulators and customers, are hard to abate sectors. That's a very powerful license to operate. And so I hope that we can rally more around that narrative in terms of how do we leverage also CCU to become more competitive, to create new economic resilience opportunities, and then hopefully, as it scales, also a potential climate benefit. So I would leave it at that.
Thanks. John, what do you think in terms of making CCU a reality at scale?
I think progressing with a degree of confidence and kind of backing these technologies and giving them an opportunity to scale, to improve, to realize learning efficiencies, and not perhaps placing too many obstacles that are there with the best of intent, but that ultimately undermine the downstream benefits that you're seeking to get. We do see some ambition emerging around CCU in the EU, for example. So it's just about giving that the relevant backing to actually see that happen.
And Sarah, final thought from you. What do you really need to succeed?
We spent the last 4.5 years proving that this technology could work. We stabilized for thousands of hours, something that, hadn't been shown stable before, like really increased the energy efficiency. So there is a path. And so now we just need for it to be a will there, because if we are supported, if we can raise, the right capital, we can make this happen. So I think it's like a message of hope. The one thing I'll say, though, is that I think we have to be ruthless and very pragmatic about what are good cases for CCU and what are not good cases for CCU, to make sure, the credibility of the field is not damaged by like poor allocation of capital and development in certain areas. And so I would really be obsessed by two metrics, which are the megawatt hour per ton of CO2 abated, and really be ruthless about making sure we apply the technology that have the highest potential for each sector, whether it's electrification or CCU, depending on the sector, or a number of other things. And then also like the dollar per ton of CO2 abated, because we want to make sure, like, ideally we have a price of carbon, a global price of carbon. That would be like a great solution. But we have to make sure that the dollars are spent at the right place for the technology that can actually scale now, and to make sure that this is we get to an optimal path to scale.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that's a really important point, and I think, as you say, if there's one takeaway that everyone should be thinking about from the show, that certainly is one of the key ones. Unfortunately, we do have to leave there, but thanks very much, all of you. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Tim.
Thanks to you, Ed. Thank you.
It's been great talking to you all. Really fascinating discussion, I think. Thanks to our producers, Toby Biggins-Gilchrist and Dan Cottrell. And above all, as ever, many thanks to all of you for listening. We really do value your feedback. Please do keep that coming. And we'll be back soon with all the latest news and views on the energy transition. Until then, goodbye.